So in a study with several co-authors, and there's a typo, it's Yang Yao. What we did was we went to 217 villages and 26 provinces in China. These are all of the non-autonomous regions, and this is a random sample of provinces. And we surveyed them to collect. We did a retrospective survey to put together their entire political reform history. So we know when is the first election, how many candidates were there, who were the leaders in each year. How was the election implemented? Was there a roving ballot box? Was there anonymous voting? Did you allow proxy voting? So on and so forth. Basically, all the issues that have come up and people who cares about this subject. And then we were able to get data from the Ministry of Agriculture, who's been collecting economic data from these villages for the last 27 years. It's a bit crazy, really, but ever since 1987, these villages and a random sample of households in these villages have been asked to fill out a weekly diary about all economic activity. And at the village government level, it's just administrative data. So we basically match this historical data on economic outcomes with our retrospective survey on political reforms. And this is going to allow us to estimate the impact of the introduction of village elections. And we asked a very simple question. Do these elections change economic outcomes and policy outcomes in a way that's consistent with real democracy, basically an increase in leadership accountability? So we're using a very narrow definition of democracy here. So this is our sample. This is our survey sample. So you see it's really very spread out. These are counties, of course, and our villages are dots in these counties. And what do? We use a very simple empirical strategy. So these elections were introduced across China over time in a staggered way. And even within provinces, it was a little bit staggered. They were implemented top-down. So the province decided when to start. And then they told the counties to go, and then it just takes some time logistically to get elections to everyone. So we're going to exploit this timing. So we're going to use something that's very close to differences in differences. We're going to compare outcomes in villages before the first election is introduced, to outcomes after the first election is introduced, and then across villages that have introduced the first election already, to villages that have not yet introduced their first election. And then, of course, we're going to control for village fixed effects, to control for all time invariant differences across villages, and year fixed effects, to control for all secular changes over time, because China is changing a lot during this time. And then we're going to control for province time trends, to control for the fact that as China changes over time, the disparity across regions is increasing. And how do we think about accountability? Well, so the Chinese government had 3 levels, right? There is a top level, which doesn't change. It's the autocratic central government, and this includes everything above the village. Then we have the village government, which used to not have elections, but now all of a sudden has an election. And then we have the villagers, the constituents. Well, to figure out whether these elections have moved accountability, it's easiest to think about 3 types of outcomes. So the first type and the way we think about these outcomes is we think about them in terms of preferences. So the first type of outcomes are the ones for which the central government and the constituents have opposing preferences for. So these are things like the one-child policy. The central government really wants the one-child policy to be enforced. Villagers really hate the one-child policy. I don't want to say everyone, but almost everyone hates the one-child policy. Similarly with upper government land expropriation. The central government wants cities to grow and they want to build highways, and by the law of eminent domain, you can permanently expropriate lands from farmers, from villages. Villages almost always hate losing land, farmland, with very few exceptions. And then, so what does this mean? Well, if the village government in the past was only accountable to the central government because they were being appointed by the central government, and now all of a sudden there are elections, what we should see, if these elections work, then we should see a partial shift in their accountability from being wholly to the central government to being now partially to the constituents and still partially to the central government. Because remember, the autocratic government above still has quite a lot of power, and the village secretary is still in play. So we should see a partial shift. And what does that mean is we should see some movement in these policy outcomes. So if there's a partial shift in accountability towards the constituents, we should see these policy outcomes move towards the preferences of the constituents. So we should see them being enforced slightly less. Well, then there's a second type of policies. These are the policies for which the central government and the villagers have the similar preferences. Or, in practice, these are things that the central government doesn't really care about, but villagers have very strong preferences. So the provision of village public goods, the central government either doesn't care or wants villagers to have whatever they or it wants villagers to be happy and have the appropriate level of public goods. The central government's not paying for this. This is all raised by villagers themselves. Or, land allocation. The central government doesn't really care about the land distribution within a village. They just want the villagers to be happy so there's no revolt. Well, if these policies don't require any effort or cause disutility of the village leader to enforce, then we're going to see no change in these policies when accountability shifts. However, if it requires effort or any type of disutility by the village leader to implement, then what theory tells us is that when there is a shift in accountability towards the constituents, the village leader is going to exert more effort to get this done. In other words, what it means is that before, the villagers, you can't really kick me out of office, so I'm just not going to go out of my way to do anything for you. But now you can kick me out of office. So if you really want public goods, then I'm going to go through the effort of raising money from the other villagers, from all villagers, to invest in the right public goods. And then the third type of policies, these are like placebo policies. So one thing you might think is that, well, whatever outcomes we see, it doesn't really say anything about a shift in accountability. What's really going on is the central government wants villages to have elections because it makes them look good. And in order to get them to have elections, they're going to just give them stuff. Like the central government's going to give them more public goods. The central government will relax the one-child policy for the villages that introduce the elections that the central government wants, so on and so forth. So we need a set of placebo outcomes of things the central government, it's very easy, that the villagers obviously want, that it's very easy for the central government to give, but for which the village government has no discretion over, right? So if these outcomes don't change, then it's very unlikely that the other outcomes are being affected by central government directives. All right, so now let's look at results. These are the regression estimates. Well, columns 1 and 2 here says that after the first election, we see a statistically significant increase in villages that now are relaxing the one-child policy. So they allow a second child if the first is a girl. And we see an almost statistically significant decrease on the incidence of upper government land expropriation. So upper government land expropriation of farmland rarely happens because it's so unpopular. So it's very hard to make this significant. Right? So we see that these type 1 policies that the central government really wants, but the villagers really don't want, they're being enforced less when we have elections, when elections are introduced. But of course, they're still enforced some, because like we said, the central government, the party apparatus is still partially in place. Now, if we look at the placebo outcomes, these are investment from the central government. This is just like transfers from the central government and distance to the nearest high school, which the village has no control over. We don't really see an effect. Now let's look at public goods. what we see is that total public goods seem to be increasing. It's almost significant. It's all being driven by funding from the villagers. There's really nothing going on in terms of transfers from the upper government, but it's not significant. And why is that? Well, total public goods is really noisy, right? What economic theory tells us to look for is to look for appropriate public goods. Public goods should be increasing in places that need these public goods. So we try to predict who needs it. And so let's focus on the interaction effects. What we're assuming is that, well, irrigation is a major public good in villages, and it's going to be villages that far more that need irrigation. And indeed, that's what we find. This is the interaction of the first election dummy, the post-first election dummy, with average log household farmland in the village. And what we see is that the more that villagers are farming in this village, the more elections increase public investment into irrigation from villagers. When we look at public investment into irrigation that's funded by transfers from the upper government, we see nothing. Similarly, when we look at schooling, these are primary schools. It's the villages with a lot of children of school age that are now investing more in schooling after they have elections. And all of the funding is coming from villagers. There is nothing there's no funding from transfer from the upper government. So we see that elections are increasing the investment into appropriate public goods, and it's all being funded by villagers. Now, another type of Type 2 policy is household land allocation. So in China, village land is divided into farmland and other land. And what happened in the early 80s or the late 70s when China was decollectivized and the household responsibility system was first in place is that the village government allocated to every household some farmland according to how many people they had to farm it, how many people they had to provide for. It was supposed to be roughly, equitable across households. But in order for the village government to adjust for demographic changes like death and births without making huge reallocations for all households in the village government was allowed to retain about 13 to 20% of the land under direct government control, village government control. So this village government land has been really controversial in recent years because people there's lots of anecdotes of how the village government, instead of leasing this land out to household farmers in the village to farm, they leased it out to enterprises. They built town and village enterprises on them, or they may even lease it out to factories from cities. And then the profits from this leasing, the reason this is controversial is villagers accuse the village government of squandering or of skimming off of the profits from leasing out this land. And what we see happening when elections are introduced is we see an increase in household farmland for almost all households in the village. So this is breaking up village households by where they are on the distribution of landholding within the village. And we see that basically everyone from the 20th to 80th percentile of land ownership is getting more land, and it's statistically significant for 5 of these groups. And where is this land coming from? Oh, this should be in parentheses, the standard errors. We see this land coming from the land that's being leased out. So when elections are introduced, village governments shift land from being leased out to factories. They reduce that, and instead they transfer that land to farmers and allow farmers within the village to farm this land.